The Genesis 32X. Much has been said about this machine, and most of it has been overwhelmingly negative. Many gaming fans and publications have gone so far as to claim that it was the straw that broke Sega's back. That's debatable, since I've heard the very same claim thrown in Saturn's direction. The year was 1994. In the United States, Sega Genesis was holding its own against the Super Nintendo, though its Japanese counterpart, Mega Drive, managed to languish in third place behind the Super Famicom and PC Engine. Sad to say, the Mega CD had done very little to improve Mega Drive's position. Meanwhile, the Atari Jaguar was on the horizon, and Sega of Japan worried that their next generation console, the Saturn, wouldn't be ready for launch. Desperate to maintain their position in North America and beat out the competition, Sega of Japan proposed a new console that would serve as nothing more than an upgraded Genesis. Unfortunately, it had to be ready within a year. Enter Sega of America. They felt it would be more economical for Sega as well as consumers to rework this proposed upgrade into yet another add-on, saving them time and money in the process. If all had gone according to plan, the Genesis 32X would have had time to flourish, keeping fans busy until Saturn launched. But you know what they say about best laid plans, right? Sega of Japan managed to release the Saturn one day after 32X launched in North America. Word spread quickly in the States, making fans question whether or not this add-on was even worth the investment. It didn't help that much of its software was rushed, meaning there were very few games that took advantage of the new hardware. In addition, many games were simply upgraded ports of Genesis or Sega CD titles. Sega CD suffered with this affliction as well. Long story short, the Genesis 32X was for all intents and purposes dead on arrival. I too feel this much maligned peripheral hurt Sega, spreading themselves far too thin creatively, technically, financially, grammatically. If they had just focused their efforts on creating one next-gen console, the gaming landscape would have looked a bit different, I think. But what do I know? First, let's just look at the console itself. My one major issue with 32X is the assembly. In spite of its advertising claims, just stick it in your Genesis, there's way more to it than that. Installation varies depending on which model of Genesis you're using. For example, I have a Model 1. You need to remove this spacer since the cartridge slot sits lower than a Model 2. Then you need a converter cable for the AV input cable linking the Genesis directly to the 32X, seeing as how the out port on a Model 1 is different from every other model available. And I'm not done. Next we have the RF shielding plates, which go into the cartridge slot. Getting them in there can be a bitch thanks to the narrow entry. They're not necessary, though I've been told they can improve the overall image quality. Personally, I haven't seen any difference. It also requires its own AC adapter. Jesus. This design is in dire need of refinement. The Sega CD was a dream by comparison. Sure, it needed an independent power source, but all you had to do was remove the extension port cover, slide it in, and presto, I now pronounce you cartridge and CD. You may kiss my ass. Thankfully, it stays put, unless you want to play the Genesis version of Virtua Racing. The 32X takes umbrage with the SVP chip. That's not a huge deal, since Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X is way better. That brings me to the launch lineup. Depending on where and when you bought this technological marvel, the three most common game bundles I saw growing up were Virtua Racing, Star Wars Arcade, and Doom. We'll start with Yu Suzuki and AM2's groundbreaking 3D racer, though, just for the sake of context, let's take a look at the Genesis version. It was the first and last title to utilize the SVP chip. Like Nintendo's Super Effects chip, it granted Genesis the ability to render 3D graphics in real time. When Virtua Racing arrived on Genesis, it cost a whopping $100. Fuck. This is basically a straight port of the arcade game. The same 3 tracks are available here, and you can only ride the Formula 1 racer. Obviously, the graphics, music, and sound effects have been scaled back significantly. Animation is choppy, the whine of our engine is somewhat annoying since music is sparse, but the control is spot on whether you're using the 3 or 6 button controller. Virtua Racing must have looked mighty impressive in '94. Then we have the 32X.
Virtua Racing!
It certainly lives up to the subtitle Deluxe. There are 2 extra vehicles, stock and prototype, each with their own unique style and handling. You even get 2 new courses, Highland and Sand Park. The graphics are a definite step up from Genesis. The frame rate is much smoother, and the cars don't look as if they're gonna shake apart at the seams. Well done. The music and voice samples are better, but that engine, it just drones on and on. I really wish there were music throughout, but I suppose that would hurt the sense of immersion. Still, it is a marked improvement. Next up, we have Star Wars Arcade, based on the '93 version, developed by LucasArts in conjunction with Sega. Gameplay is rather basic. The first and third stages consist of several TIE fighters, bombers, and interceptors, all of which must be destroyed before time runs out. The second stage is the Super Stardestroyer, while the third and last are, well, you guessed it, the dreaded Death Star. In addition to arcade mode, there's a 32X mode boasting 4 extra levels, but they basically consist of bland asteroid fields and more Star Destroyers. If you should elect this option, you can take control of the Y-Wing. It may be slower than the X-Wing, but it gives you an extra hit. Like Virtua Racing, the graphics and sound are far from arcade perfect, though it looks and sounds better than it would have using the SVP chip, I imagine. The Star Wars theme is good, but in-game music is weak. If I didn't know any better, I'd swear they gave John Williams a Casio keyboard and said, "Do your best." Sound effects are pretty sweet. All the laser blasts and fighters whizzing by are faithful to that galaxy far, far away. Star Wars Arcade has been criticized for being repetitious, which is kind of absurd. Seriously, it's an arcade game for crying out loud. Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter are pretty repetitive, but I didn't hear anyone bitching then. I would understand if they were complaining about the difficulty though. All arcade games are quarter munchers, I get it, but this is the home game, goddammit! I'm not asking for an easy setting, I just want unlimited continues. The first serious challenge you take on is the Super Stardestroyer. This is a classic example of trial and error gameplay. It's a trench run of sorts where you gotta blast turrets and fend off pursuing TIEs as you make your way toward the main reactor. While you can shoot incoming projectiles, you won't get them all, and you can't focus on one threat while ignoring the other. The only way to beat it is to memorize all the missile turret placements and destroy them as soon as they appear. Which is easier said than done, obviously. And I used to love this song. Oh, that's nice. I'll share that sentiment with your mother, you 6'1" asthmatic bastard. Star Wars Arcade is a good game and well worth your time. Yoda knows it won't break the bank. Now we have Doom, easily the most controversial title of the bunch. Fans have ripped it to shreds, often comparing it unfavorably to the Super Nintendo version. The top 3 criticisms are: 1. The music. I'll be honest, this is some bad shit. It isn't all that dissimilar from another first-person shooter, Zero Tolerance on Genesis, but not as clean. There are instances where the score is littered with pops, almost as if it had been mixed too high. When you compare it to the Super Nintendo, yeah, no contest. 2. Fewer levels. Only 17 of the original 22 stages made it, and like every other port, including Super Nintendo, many of them were retextured and adjusted ever so slightly. With the Super Nintendo, all stages are present. Mario heads will present this as proof of Nintendo supremacy, but that's invalid. But wait, why? Don't worry, I'm getting to that. 3. The frame of doom. Literally, the frame, or border if you will. This really upsets fans for whatever reason. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather the image filled the screen, but I've seen worse. Again, remember zero tolerance? I feel as if I'm looking through a mail slot. Contrary to popular belief, the Super Nintendo port has a border. You see all this black shit? That's a border, people. Even Star Fox had a border. So the 32X was, technically speaking, more powerful than Super Nintendo, yet this port suffered. Why? It had nothing to do with hardware, but time. This version was rushed in order to make the 32X launch date. John Carmack himself had to work day and night in order to meet Sega's deadline. The Super Nintendo version was released 2 months shy of a year after 32X, giving them more development time without the added pressure of producing a launch title. I feel the 32X version beats Super Nintendo in regards to visuals, gameplay, and control. Even the sound effects are better. Yeah, that's the chainsaw. Is it even on, or is Doom Guy farting? No, it's on. With 32X, the frame rate is consistently smooth, rarely lagging due to the amount of on-screen enemies or the immense scale of some environments. Enemies aren't a mess of pixels when viewed from afar, and texture maps are more detailed. Look, in the end, Super Nintendo may have more levels, better music, and a few more enemies, but in my opinion, it lacks the visuals, control, and sheer fun factor of 32X. Personally, I feel that's more important. That's the 32X in a nutshell. It may have been a mistake, but it's probably one of my favorites in spite of its many flaws. I'll be sharing more because there are plenty of games worthy of note available for this 32-bit distortion. Until next time, just stick it in your Genesis, fucker.